I said, I'm going to be presenting on a systematic review and meta-analysis on interventions to improve social connections. Now, just a couple of working definitions for the presentation. Social isolation is going to refer to an objective absence of social interactions and/or relationships, whereas social participation is going to refer to engaging in objective social contact. So this includes things like social activities, socializing with others, and even participating in volunteer work. Now, in our study, we've operationalized these two constructs as lying on a continuum of objective social contacts. Loneliness, on the other hand, is going to refer to the distressing emotion that accompanies the subjective experience of being socially isolated, whereas social connectedness refers to the perception of having reciprocally meaningful social contact. Now, these two constructs we've operationalized in our study as lying on a continuum of quality of social connections. So we have an objective continuum and a subjective continuum. But why have we made that distinction? Well, the short answer is because the literature seems to allude to it. For example, we know that social isolation and social participation have inverse effects on health. We also know that scales for loneliness correlate negatively with scales for social connectedness. And in fact, those scales of loneliness are often operationalized to measure social connectedness. We know from structural equation modeling studies that high levels of social connectedness have a direct negative relationship with loneliness. And as with the objective continuum, we know that loneliness and social connectedness have inverse effects on health. Now, given the link between these constructs and health, it's imperative that we design interventions to promote the formation of meaningful social connections. But we're not the first ones to have thought of that. There are a number of qualitative reviews out there, and for the most part, they've concluded that interventions were effective. However, the individual studies often lacked quality. So they tended to adopt a non-randomized design, for example. In contrast, when a more conservative approach is taken and focus is placed exclusively on randomized controlled trials, one of the reviews have shown that the interventions didn't provide a benefit. Now, this heterogeneity raises concerns about the reliability of conclusions from these pre-existing qualitative reviews. Furthermore, only one qualitative review to date has attempted to distinguish between interventions for objective versus subjective isolation. So the study by Maya et al. Concluded that different types of interventions were effective for either objective or subjective isolation. And although the findings were promising, the study was limited to people with clinical symptoms, and it didn't consider objective and subjective isolation as lying on separate continua. So it acknowledged that they were separate entities, but didn't treat them as being on a continuum, meaning their review didn't capture interventions for things like social participation or social connectedness. Furthermore, an inherent limitation of not just the Maya et al. Study, but all of the other qualitative reviews is that they don't provide any quantitative data and makes it really hard to sort of see what sort of effects we're getting and whether there's differences between different kinds of interventions or even outcomes. But again, we weren't the only ones to have thought of that either. In 2011, Maya et al. Published a systematic review and meta-analysis of interventions for loneliness. And what their study found was that overall, the interventions provided a benefit. But interestingly, it was these interventions that addressed maladaptive social cognitions, as labeled by those study authors, which led to the greatest reductions in loneliness. Now, that's a pretty important finding because it has a lot of serious clinical implications in terms of what sort of mechanism we need to target in these sorts of interventions. But there are several limitations with their review nonetheless. For instance, they didn't compare interventions for objective or subjective dimensions of social contact, as was similarly a limitation in all of the previous qualitative reviews. But on top of that, that important finding that, these maladaptive social cognitions are what we need to target was based on only 4 studies, of which only 2 used evidence-based strategies to actually elicit cognitive change, and none of which actually measured changes to those social cognitions. Therefore, it's actually unclear whether those cognitive changes are a critical mechanism underpinning successful interventions for loneliness. So what we wanted to do in our study was bridge some of these gaps by looking at the effectiveness of interventions designed to promote either objective social contact or the quality of social connections. We also wanted to identify the most effective intervention type across either of the continua, and we wanted to explore the potential mechanisms underpinning these interventions. Then the way we went about doing that was by doing our own systematic review and meta-analysis. So I'll just quickly run through it. In terms of the inclusion criteria, we sampled adults greater than 18 years of age, irrespective of their health status. But I just wanted to quickly flag that although our inclusion criteria included adults across the adult lifespan, the majority of the studies were conducted in older adults. So the mean age of our sample was 62 years. We included any intervention as long as it was designed to specifically and directly target one of those 4 constructs. We only looked at RCTs, and we looked at quantitative changes in those 4 constructs as long as it was a primary or co-primary outcome. We conducted our risk of bias assessments, our meta-analyses via STATA, and just quickly in terms of the coding, we had 4 different types of interventions. Firstly, we had the social skills training interventions, which focused on improving participants' interpersonal communication skills. Next, we had the social support interventions, which provided participants with social support in the form of regular contact, care, or companionship. Social access interventions, which provided participants with opportunities for social interaction. And psychological interventions, which provided participants with psychological strategies to better manage their distress. This is just the flow chart. The main take-home message is that after the whole screening process, we had about 58 studies that met our inclusion criteria. So it was a pretty big data set. In terms of the results, let's look at the results for the objective continuum first. What we saw here was that overall, interventions led to a significant improvement in objective social contact. And we saw that it was these social access interventions which were driving the majority of this effect. So they led to those significant increases, whereas things like the social support or psychological interventions yielded non-significant effects. We also saw that the group format led to significant increases in objective social contact compared to an individual format or a combination of individual and group sessions. In terms of the subjective continuum, what we saw here was that overall interventions led to significant reductions in deficits in the perceived quality of social connections, but this time it was the psychological interventions that were driving these reductions. But again, the group format also seemed to be providing some benefit here as well, compared to individual sessions or again, individual or a combination of individual and group, sorry. So what does it all mean? Well, the results of our meta-analysis showed that constructs along the 2 continua responded optimally to different kinds of interventions. Providing adults with opportunities to interact with others led to significant increases in objective social contact, whereas providing adults with psychological strategies to better manage distress led to significant improvements in the quality of their social connections. In terms of the objective continuum, we saw that it was these social access interventions which were the most effective. And in terms of the mechanisms underlying those kinds of interventions, the effectiveness of these social access interventions largely depended on their ability to increase the size of one's social network, which was best achieved within a group format. Hence, objective social contact is improved most effectively through direct, practical strategies. Unfortunately, however, the effect estimate was based on studies that did not employ a follow-up assessment, making it unclear whether these effects are maintained once access to the group is actually removed. On top of that, although these social access interventions were able to improve objective social contact, there was no evidence to suggest that they led to significant reductions in deficits in the perceived quality of social connections. Hence, the quality of social relationships did not necessarily follow from their quantity. Instead, it's more likely that additional strategies, such as addressing maladaptive cognitive biases or other psychological factors maintaining this connection, are needed. In terms of the subjective continuum, here we saw that the psychological interventions were the most effective, and this aligns well with recent models of loneliness that have emphasized maladaptive cognitions and avoidance behavior in maintaining loneliness. Of the 12 psychological interventions that targeted these deficits in the perceived quality of social connections, what we saw was that a total of 5 used CBT techniques to address barriers to social connections. Now, subgroup analyses weren't possible because we didn't have enough studies, but the psychological interventions that focused on cognitive and behavioral strategies yielded the largest effect sizes, emphasizing the importance of targeting these maintaining factors. So things like maladaptive cognitions, but also things like avoidance behavior as well. Now, interestingly, we saw that the group sessions were also really beneficial for improving these deficits in the perceived quality of social connections. And this aligns well with some of the work done by the Haslam Group, which have, in essence, operationalized these group sessions as providing individuals the opportunity to access social support through shared social identification. So this is basically where individuals within the group perceive other group members as part of the self, which in turn motivates them to promote their own well-being. And again, this really just emphasizes this notion that it's the quality of the social ties that is really important. But yeah, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dino. We have one question for you. First of all, it's a very nice presentation, as Joyce notices. And she was wondering how your findings extend those to which are related to your topic by Andy Dickens, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure Andy Dickens is one of the reviews I cited in one of the slides. So just off the top of my head, if I remember the review by Andy Dickens, they looked at interventions for social isolation specifically. Joyce, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So I guess to answer your question, the way in which our review differs is that we've taken an approach of taking things like social isolation, loneliness, social participation, and social connectedness, and throwing them onto a continuum. So we have the objective continuum and the subjective continuum. And we think that these continuum need to be treated as separate, entities, because it doesn't make sense to target the objective side of things in the same way that you target the subjective side of things. So I guess our review was a bit different in that we included interventions for different kinds of constructs, and interventions were operationalized as being on separate continua as opposed to sort of lumping them all in together.
Excellent. Thank you for a nice review of the connection with Andy Dickens' work.